I'd like to talk about a topic that's most relevant in today's urban school environment, and that's the topic of parental engagement. I hear many people, urban school principals included, often say that parents that have students in urban schools are disengaged, uh, they're not involved in the learning process, and they don't come to the school in large numbers and really represent for their children and the school on a consistent basis. And for the most part, a lot of the talk may be true in some instances, but I like to introduce a different perspective that can give urban school principals and school administrators a different avenue to try and a different outlook on how they can tackle this most onerous problem. And I would like to have urban school principals take a page out of today's current music industry artists, and in terms of how they can see what they're doing and maybe see some relevance and apply that to parental engagement in urban schools. And matter of fact, I would like to use that as a metaphor for explaining how they can do so. Okay, so if you look at the current music industry and the current climate, all right, artists today aren't selling records the way they used to. All right, and this kind of started in the mid '90s. Okay, and one thing that took place is that technology introduced different elements to the music industry. It used to be a time from the '90s and prior that it was very lucrative for a artist to get a record deal because the music industry labels they had a monopoly on the industry. They produced CDs at a relatively inexpensive rate, and they sold them at a high market value. And so it was, for most part, lucrative to get a record deal because if you sold a good amount of records, you can make a lot of money. Okay, but around the early to mid '90s, all of that started to change, and the chief reason was technology, because technology introduced a different element to the game. All right. Prior to the '90s, there was only one way that you can consume music. All right, and that was through CDs. Most people, if they wanted to buy listen to their music and listen to it at a high quality, they bought a CD. All right, and that was the only way that music was able to be consumed. But then in the early to mid '90s, that started to change because technology allowed people to listen to music in different ways. They was able to stream music. They was able to download music. They were able to do a lot of different things with the music that they wanted to listen to, and it didn't involve going to the record store and buying a CD. So what ended up happening over a span of 10, 15 years, even to today, that a lot of artists didn't get the record sales that they once had. Okay, and so instead of giving up and quitting and griping and complaining, a lot of artists they changed with the time, and they said, okay, I'm going to put out a record, the best record that I can put out, and even though I won't get high record sales, but if I do sell a million records, that's beautiful. But if I don't, I'm not going to worry about it because what I'm going to do, I'm going to connect with my core audience. And a core audience may not be a million people. It may not be 2 million people. It could be 100,000 people. It could be 200,000 people. But I'm going to connect with my core audience. And my core audience may buy my records, they may not. But because they consume music in different ways, they're going to still listen to it somehow. And my core audience, because they're my core audience and they like what I do and they like the music that I produce, those people will eventually buy tickets to my concerts, they'll buy merchandise, they'll buy memorabilia, so on and so forth. So if I'm an artist and I connect with my core audience, I can still have a career. Now, let's take that same scenario and transfer it over to urban school principals and urban schools when you talk about professional development. When you talk about parental engagement, excuse me. So, dealing with parental engagement, it used to be a time where urban schools, and when I say urban schools, I'm talking about schools that predominantly serve families or students that come from families of low socioeconomic status and poverty. Okay, so it used to be a time where these low socioeconomic status communities, they sent their students to the public schools that's in their neighborhood, and the public schools, these urban schools had a monopoly on the students that they served. There were no other schools in the area, and because the families were poor, they didn't have any options for private school and whatnot. So they sent their students to the community public school, which we call today urban schools. All right. And because urban schools didn't have to do anything, they had a monopoly on the student population. They didn't care about parental engagement. Okay. And because they didn't care, they didn't put much effort into it. Okay. But over time, especially around the early to mid 90s, what happened? All right, there were a couple of things that happened, but one major thing that happened was that you had the advent of charter schools. Charter schools started to pop up in every major urban center. All right, they started popping up all over the place. And another thing that happened was voucher programs started to become introduced. So if I'm a parent and my student is attending a failing school, I can apply and obtain a voucher and use that voucher to go to a private or parochial school of my choice. And that voucher will help me pay for some or all of the costs. So what these two things did, they changed the game, okay? And they changed it and gave the families in these poor communities different educational options. And even though a lot of times the charter schools do not outperform the public schools, the perception is that they do, because the charter schools, they package their schools and they sell their programs and they advertise and they promote the things that they do well. So, but what are the urban schools are doing? Sitting back, doing nothing, complaining. Okay. So there were used to be times where the urban school would have 50, 60, 70, 80 plus thousand students enrolled in their school district. But then around the 90s, with the advent of charter schools and voucher programs, those numbers start to dwindle. So school districts that had 80 plus thousand students now looking at 30,000, 25,000. All right. Budget cuts going off everywhere. And the leading cause of this is the lack of parental engagement. All right. A lot of these urban public schools, and particularly the school principals, are not making a conscious effort to engage the parents. Okay. So the end result is the parents don't feel satisfied. They take their students to whatever options that they can, which usually end up being a charter school or a voucher program. Now, I'm saying that the urban school principal, no matter what level you are, high school, middle, or elementary school, you need to take a page out of the music artist notebook. And instead of complaining, griping, and moaning about, you know, the parents aren't doing this, the parents aren't doing that, we're losing money, we got to make cuts, and so on and so forth, adapt to the times and make the change. Okay? So you have to be able to connect with your core parental group. So you, because of the different circumstances and things that are involved, you will not get a whole lot of parents involved, a whole lot of parents engaged. Okay, because number one, I talked about the charter schools, I talked about the voucher programs, but one thing that I left out is that when you're dealing with urban communities and especially communities of low socioeconomic status, you're dealing with unemployment, you're dealing with subpar healthcare, you're dealing with subpar housing, you're dealing with teen pregnancy, you're dealing with undiagnosed mental illness, you're dealing with gang violence, you're dealing with drugs, you're dealing with substance abuse, alcoholism. All of these things are a prevalent and permeable part of the urban centers, the urban communities, poor, low socioeconomic status communities. So the people within those communities are affected by those things. And since the school is an extension of the community, the school will inevitably feel the effects of such ills. So because parents have options and because they're dealing with a lot of ills into their society and environments where they live, chances are you're not going to get a host of parents come to meetings. You're not going to get a bunch of parents show up at back to school nights and parental engagement night and things of that nature, things that a lot of urban schools like to do. You're not going to get that. And just because you advertise or you say, hey, this is a time when parents can come up to the school, we want to talk to you, doesn't mean that they're going to show up because you haven't connected with your core audience, your core population. So what most urban schools do, they're thinking as if they're in an urban school. I mean, if they're in a suburban school or a school that have more affluent parents. So what they do is they're judging their parental engagement by another standard. So that's just like the music artist trying to judge current state of the music industry with the past state. You can't do that. You have to judge the situation and judge your parental engagement and involvement based on the circumstances that you're dealing with. So what that means is you have to connect with your core parental group, your core parent audience, and once you connect with them, you can use that core group. You don't need a large quantity. You use that core group to build, and you use them to involve them into the decision-making processes and things that are around the school. You can get more done with a core group of parents than you can with an entire school full.